Professor Dehousse. Should we move on without further ado?
Yes, thank you. It's hard to add much to the many important things that have been said by my two learned colleagues, but I'd like to make two small remarks on how basically the emergence of these strong centrifugal pressures can be incorporated somehow in the political system of the European Union, which I think is the big challenge we have now ahead of us. I mean, we heard in the State of the Union speech of President Juncker a number of suggestions as to how to, let's say, improve the governance of the Union. President Macron was expected to deliver a grand speech with a number of proposals with potentially far-reaching implications. I haven't had yet the opportunity of reading the speech, but clearly this seems to announce a season of further movement. With what impact is an open question. But before moving on to that, let me perhaps just run a little commercial ad to stress that the presentation that was given by Hanspeter Kriesi is based on a research project that he has carried out for a number of years now with funding from the European Research Council. And I stress this because it shows that even cutting-edge frontier research, if I speak the language of the ERC properly, and I speak under the control of Angela Liberatore, can be of extreme relevance to understand today's problems, and not least today's problems of the Union. And it's important to stress that because it's part of our, let's say, professional challenge as scholars to make our findings accessible to wider community. End of commercial. I revert to the heart of the matter. What I see is, of course, a very difficult challenge because, as you heard from the first two speakers, what we have witnessed in recent years is the emergence of more and more contrasted visions of what it is that the Europeans at large want. What has happened in the meantime at the European level? It would have made sense to expect that because there were more and more contrasting visions of what the future is to be made of, one would have witnessed a pause in the integration process. But the fact is that this is not what has happened. Even though there was no strong appetite for further integration in the population of the various member countries, even if a number of governments repeatedly said this is not the time for more integration, what we have witnessed under the pressure of events, I emphasize these words because they're, I think, crucial to understanding the dynamics of all this. Under the pressure of events, we have witnessed large transfers of authority to the European level in the field of economic and in the field of financial integration. First, and to a lesser degree, in the handling of the migration challenge, which suggests that, contrary to what a number of people had been saying for years, despite the growing opposition to Europe in various corners, and despite the diversity of oppositions, because when we say opposition, we sort of assume that it's a single phenomenon. No, as we just heard from Hanspeter, it's a multiplicity of distinct, discrete phenomena. And that is a challenge in its own right. So we had, some would say, more integration by stealth. I would say, I repeat, integration under the pressure of events for lack of a better alternative, because even reluctant governments had to concede that something had to be done in order to save the euro. And something had to be done to handle the massive influx of migrants. I'm not saying that all that has been done the way it should have, or that this is by any means over. But action was needed, and that action translated in further integration, first thing. Second thing, while this was happening, we witnessed in Brussels, so to say, the emergence of a phenomenon that was, I think, announced 25 years ago by the Maastricht Treaty, namely a process whereby the European Parliament gradually gained ground in the appointment of the Commission, with the system that you know of so-called Spitzenkandidaten, which very few people believed would actually result in delivering the choice of a Commission president. And I must confess, I was part of the skeptics. I was convinced that because, let's say, this entailed a major relinquishing of power on the side of the European Council, they would not accept it. And yet, as you know, what happened was that we had a number of candidates that started occupying the floor, prompted a debate which convinced even reluctant parties to do the same. It's a well-known fact that in 2013, Chancellor Merkel was not extremely enthusiastic about this process, that she wanted the European Council to retain the final say over the selection of the president. But you know the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that the EPP won the largest number of seats in the European Parliament, and therefore was in a position to impose its own candidate for the Commission presidency. Does this mean that while opposition was growing at the nation state, we witnessed a complete federalization of the political system of the EU? Of course not. When it came to appointing the other members of the Commission, the party logic that had delivered the presidency of Jean-Claude Juncker did not work in the same manner. And as we also know, it did not translate into a grand coalition or any coalition agreement in the European Parliament. So we are somewhere in the middle of the river with a political process that has indeed been characterized by, well, observers of the European Parliament would use the same term used by Hanspeter, politicization, but of course referring to something else, to party politicization, which is not the kind of phenomenon he described. Anyhow, what we witnessed, I think, was a certain degree of disconnect between the European process on the one hand and the emergence of strong opposition to the EU at the national level on the other. And this is, I think, what lies in the background, and a kind of structural tension that will need to be addressed in the discussions to come. Because, of course, it might be tempting, and we know that some, including former alumni of the Institute, keep saying that what we need is politicization in the sense of party politicization at the European level to make things clearer for the voters at the time of the European elections. Well, I think there is a dynamics inbuilt into the system that will make it very difficult not to replicate in the forthcoming European elections the system of the Spitzenkandidaten. Will it go further in 2019 than it has in 2014 remains to be seen. But here I would really issue a word of caution. It seems to me that it is important in our thinking about these issues to integrate precisely what we know of the evolution of, let's say, the attitude towards Europe of European citizens. It's what I would find worrying is the development at European level of a system that would be entirely premised on the idea that somehow party logic should determine the outcome of the election without at all paying attention to what we hear from the periphery. And it boils down to a very simple issue which needs to be integrated into future thinking. The fact that the EU system, no matter how we want to call it, is and is bound to remain a multi-level system in which the member countries will play a central role. We have had for many years a system of accommodation between the preferences of various countries. Party logic, the way it operates at the European level, is not in a position, because of the wide contrast that exists between the various preferences of different political groups within different regions of Europe, it is not in a position to deliver a kind of cohesive majority that would command the program of a future Commission and a future Parliament. So the question is how to reconcile basically the majoritarian drift which we see emerging from the transposition at European level of a parliamentary system with the strong anti-majoritarian DNA of the European Union. Yes, we vote, but when we vote, it's not every day. And when we vote, it's always with super majorities aimed at making sure that no one is cornered all too often. Let's keep that in mind, which is not an invitation to stick to unanimity, but let's keep in mind the extreme diversity of the member states of the EU and of their respective preferences when discussing about blueprints for future integration. That's the only recommendation I would put in mind for tonight, and I will stop here. Thank you.